The Detroit Lions just made a move that might not grab headlines right away, but it's the kind of under-the-radar decision that tells you a lot about how this roster is being shaped behind the scenes. A familiar name is back in the building, and if you've been paying attention, you probably remember the flashes that made him at least worth watching. Kai Robichaud is back on the roster, and while this isn't the type of addition that suddenly changes expectations for the season, it absolutely adds an interesting layer to the running back room heading into minicamps and beyond. He's not your typical flashy prospect. At 6 foot, 217 pounds, he brings a physical presence that fits more into that power back mold, but there's also just enough explosiveness in his game to make you wonder if there's something more there. This isn't a player who dominated headlines coming out of college, even though he had productive stretches at Boston College. The reality is, what held him back was pretty clear. His top-end speed just didn't impress, especially with a 4.67 in the 40-yard dash. In today's NFL, that's a tough number to overcome, especially at a position where speed can define opportunity. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite that limitation, the traits that show up on film, and even in scouting breakdowns, paint a picture of a player who does a lot of the small things right. Ball security, patience, vision, and the ability to operate effectively in power and inside zone schemes. Those are not meaningless traits, especially in an offense that already knows how to maximize different types of runners. The weaknesses are just as clear though. He's not particularly elusive in space, and he's not expected to make a major impact in the passing game. So the question becomes simple: is there a role here, or is this just another camp body? And that's why this move matters more than it seems. This is the time of year where depth starts to take shape. Rookie minicamps are approaching, competition is about to increase, and every roster spot starts to feel more contested. Players like Robichaud aren't expected to carry the offense, but they can absolutely carve out roles if they prove reliable enough in specific situations. Short yardage, clock management, physical runs late in games. Those are the types of areas where someone like him could quietly stick around longer than people expect. At the same time, there's another storyline developing that feels much bigger, and honestly, a lot more emotional for fans who've been following this team for years. Taylor Decker's situation continues to feel unresolved, and the tone around it is starting to shift in a way that suggests this might not have the ending many were hoping for. He's made it clear that his intention was to stay in Detroit. That was the goal. That was the plan. But as we've seen time and time again in the NFL, plans don't always line up with reality. There's something brutally honest about the way veteran careers tend to end in this league. Very few players get that perfect ending, the kind where you walk away on your own terms, maybe after a championship run with everything neatly wrapped up. That's the exception, not the rule. More often, it's messy. Players get released, interest around the league isn't what it once was, and eventually the decision is made for them, and that's kind of where this situation feels like it might be heading. Decker reportedly has no interest in playing for division rivals like the Bears or Packers, which tells you a lot about where his mindset is. He wants to compete. He wants to be in a winning environment, and more than anything, he wanted that to continue in Detroit. But the reality is, the Lions have been moving forward. They've been building, adjusting, and preparing for the future, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions about players who have been foundational pieces in the past. Could there be a scenario where he returns? It would likely require a significant shift, maybe even a major pay cut, and even then, it feels like the team has already started to move in a different direction. That's what makes this so difficult. It's not just about performance, it's about timing, roster construction, and the harsh reality of how quickly things change in the NFL. And when you step back and look at everything happening, from low-key roster additions like Robichaud to the uncertain future of a veteran like Decker, you start to see the full picture of a team that's still evolving. This isn't a finished product, it's a team balancing immediate success with long-term sustainability, constantly making decisions that may not always be popular but are clearly part of a bigger plan. So now it comes down to perspective. Are these the kinds of moves that build depth and keep the roster competitive over time? Or are there risks in letting experienced players walk while relying on unproven pieces to step up? What do you think? Are the Lions making the right calls here? Or is this the kind of transition that could come back to hurt them later? And that's where things start to get even more interesting, because when you zoom out from just the individual moves and really look at the bigger picture, you can feel this underlying tension between what this team has been and what it's trying to become. The Detroit Lions are no longer that team just trying to figure things out. They've already built something explosive on offense, something that can go toe-to-toe with almost anyone in the league. But the question that keeps coming back, and you've probably felt this too, is what happens if the other side of the ball finally catches up? That brings us to a conversation that always sparks strong opinions among fans. What does a true elite Lions defense even look like? Because if you go back and look at some of the all-time names associated with this franchise, there's a mix of respect, nostalgia, and in some cases, frustration. And that's exactly what came up when looking at one version of the Lions' all-time defense. You've got names like Ndamukong Suh, and right away, that alone divides the room. There's no denying the talent. At his peak, he was dominant, disruptive, and capable of completely changing a game. But at the same time, there were those moments, those penalties, those decisions that left fans shaking their heads. It's that complicated legacy where production and frustration exist side by side. Some fans still see him as a cornerstone of that era, while others never fully embraced him because of how things played out on the field and even after his time in Detroit. Then you go even further back and you see names like Roger Brown, guys from eras that a lot of current fans didn't get to experience live. That's where things get tricky because you're balancing history with what you've actually seen. It's easy to respect the legends, but it's also natural to connect more with players from more recent years, and that's why debates like this never really have a clear answer. They're shaped by perspective as much as performance. On the edge, players like Robert Porcher represent a time that a lot of fans still hold on to. That 90s era had its own identity, and Porcher was a big part of it. But now, when you look at the current roster, it's hard not to immediately think about where someone like Aiden Hutchinson fits into that conversation. Even without forcing current players into historical rankings, you can already see the trajectory. There's a real chance that the next version of this all-time discussion is going to include several names from this current group. The linebacker conversation is where things get even more debatable. You've got names like Chris Spielman, a player who embodies toughness and leadership, someone fans still deeply respect. But then you see a name like DeAndre Levy, and that's where the debate heats up. Levy had strong seasons, no doubt about it, but when you compare across eras, or even to what the Lions are building now, it raises questions. Because when you look at someone like Jack Campbell and the role he's starting to grow into, you can already imagine how quickly these rankings could shift if development continues the way the team hopes. And in the secondary, it's the same story. Legends like Night Train Lane and Dick LeBeau represent a different era of football, one that helped define the foundation of defensive play in the league. Then you mix in more modern contributors like Glover Quinn, who quietly became one of the more reliable pieces during his time in Detroit. And again, it leads you right back to the present, where players like Brian Branch are starting to show flashes that make you think, okay, this could be different this time. But here's the core of it all, and this is what really matters going into this season. For years, the Lions have lived in this reality where the offense carries the identity. It's been explosive, exciting, and capable of putting up points against anyone. But the defense, it's been inconsistent at best for a long time. Outside of that stretch around 2014, it's been nearly a decade of trying to find that balance. And even recently, when the defense hasn't been statistically dominant, they've found ways to make key plays, especially through turnovers. That's been the difference. Because being ranked in the low 20s defensively doesn't necessarily kill you if you're taking the ball away and giving your offense more opportunities. But if those turnovers disappear, then the cracks start to show a lot more clearly. That's why this upcoming stretch feels so important. Because if this defense can take even a moderate step forward, not necessarily becoming elite overnight, but just more consistent, more reliable, it completely changes the ceiling of this team. Suddenly, you're not just relying on shootouts. You're not just hoping the offense bails you out every week. You become a team that can control games in multiple ways. And that's the part that should have every fan paying close attention right now. Because while additions like Kai Robichaud might seem small, and situations like Taylor Deckers might feel like tough transitions, all of it connects back to one central goal: building a roster that can sustain success, not just flash it. So now it's your turn to be part of this conversation. Do you believe this current Lions team is finally on the path to building a defense that can match its offense? Or are we still a long way from seeing that complete balanced team in Detroit? And the truth is, this is exactly where teams either take that final step or fall just short of it. The margin isn't huge. It's not about completely rebuilding anything anymore. It's about refining, tightening the gaps, and getting just a little bit better in the areas that have held you back. Because think about it, how many games over the last couple of seasons came down to just 1 or 2 defensive stops that didn't happen? That's the difference between being a good team and being a true contender. The offense has already proven it can carry its weight. Now it's about whether the defense can meet it halfway. And that's why every decision right now matters more than it might seem on the surface. Depth signings, roster battles, moving on from veterans, trusting younger players. This is all part of shaping that identity. It's not always comfortable, and it's definitely not always popular, but it's how teams evolve. So as we move closer to the season, keep an eye on how these pieces come together. Watch who steps up, who earns those roles, and how this defense starts to define itself. Because if it clicks, even just enough, it could completely change what this team is capable of. Because at the end of the day, belief is what separates the outside perception from what's actually building inside that locker room. From the outside, it's easy to point at weaknesses, to question decisions, to wonder if moving on from certain players or bringing in under-the-radar names is enough. But inside the organization, every one of these moves is connected to a very specific vision of what this team is supposed to become. And that vision isn't about being flashy in the offseason. It's about being complete when it matters most. You can already see how intentional things are. The offense wasn't built overnight. It was layered piece by piece until it became one of the most dangerous units in the league. And now, whether fans realize it or not, the same process is happening on defense. It's just not as loud yet. Defensive development doesn't always show up immediately in highlights or headlines. Sometimes it shows up in fewer missed tackles, better positioning, more discipline, and those small situational wins that don't always get talked about, but decide games. And that's where the real test is coming. Not in what this team looks like on paper, but in how it performs when the pressure hits. Third downs, red zone stops, late game drives where you need one defensive stand to seal it. That's where everything we're talking about either comes together or falls apart. Because let's be honest, this team is past the stage of just being exciting. That's not enough anymore. The expectations have changed. Fans aren't just hoping for improvement, they're expecting results. They're expecting this team to compete deep into the season, to win big games, and to prove that what's been built over the last few years is real. And that's why this moment feels different. There's